Let's talk about Guilty Gear Xrd. Guilty Gear Xrd is the third, technically, game in the Guilty Gear franchise. Releasing in 2014 to overwhelming praise, Xrd had several iterative updates before eventually finishing its life cycle on Guilty Gear Xrd Rev 2. After this, the series went dark for a while until Guilty Gear Strive came out and divided the community somewhat by changing a lot of the aspects about the core gameplay. Over the next few years, Xrd was shown to have somewhat of a cult following, with hardcore players swearing by the game being an absolute masterpiece of fighting games. A game no other game could even come close to being as good as. God forbid you bring up Strive in a conversation with an Xrd player. But there was always something that held the game back from breaking past all of the other Guilty Gear games. Hell, any other fighting game that's been made in recent years. And that's the fact that it didn't have rollback netcode. Until now. Well, until a few weeks ago, really. For one short week, Arxis blessed the game with rollback netcode, meaning everyone could play the game delay-free. And like a lot of people, this was my first time properly checking out Guilty Gear Xrd. As the terrible online play and literally zero locals running the game in my region, I never really decided to give the game a proper shot. So is the game the greatest fighting game ever made? The killer of other fighting games? The one to rule them all? No. Playing Xrd for the first time as a new player feels like going into an exam you haven't practiced for. The game feels like a game that everyone has spent the past 8 years labbing setup combos and pressure and haven't actually figured out how to fight their opponents. Don't get me wrong, I played a good amount of the game, clocking in about 20 hours, 2 tournament runs, and over 100 online matches, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hit with knowledge check constantly instead of, playing a fighting game. Sometimes I'd run into someone who would kick my ass in ways I couldn't even comprehend, but then I'd figure out what they were doing and they'd just crumble instantly. Granted, this didn't always happen, as my second tournament run had me losing literally every match I played. It was a round-robin format, by the way, so I went 0-15. But why does the game feel like that? Well, it's a mixture of the character power and the joy of learning. See, Xrd characters all have things that are extremely unique about them. They all have things that they can do that you wouldn't expect, and learning what these characters can get away with is a big part of the game. Not to mention that learning things that your character can do is just fun for fighting game players. I have to admit, finally being able to do a dust loop in a Guilty Gear game is really satisfying, especially because I struggled with it at first. The most fun I had with Xrd was learning something for Soul, labbing it, then trying it out with my friends who were learning alongside me. Since we were all learning at the same time, we only ever had a few gimmicks that we could use against each other when we fought everyone. It wasn't like everyone had an overwhelming bag of tricks that you needed to know the answers to every single time, which is what it felt like when I fought other people online. When I did eventually learn how to deal with the little mix-ups and gimmicks that my friends had, we forced them to play neutral and footsies, which is something that I'm kind of good at. But trying out new things every match, seeing if it worked or didn't, and taking these findings back to the lab was one of the best fighting game cycles I've had. But this isn't a review of Xrd. Well, not anymore, I guess. If you're wondering what my feelings are on the game after all of that, I think it's an interesting game that has some major flaws and is extremely uninviting for newcomers. But if you're okay with a lot of metered bullshit, oppressive top tiers, and having to learn basically an entire new game every time the opponent picks a new character on the character select screen, you'll probably end up loving this game. No hate to the game, but it really is an experience you need to stick out for a long time before you really start to appreciate it. No, this is about how the experiences I had with my short time in Xrd led to me improving in my Strive gameplay. There's 3 big things that I want to go over that I genuinely believe helped me in Strive. So let's start with what might be the smallest and most obvious thing I learned. For those of you out of the loop, Guilty Gear has a system known as Roman Cancel, where you're able to spend a bit of meter to return your character back to neutral after an attack. Roman Cancel had a big change between XX and Xrd, with you now being able to cancel the startup of any move with 25 meter. XX did have a system like this known as Force Roman Cancel, however you had to Roman Cancel in a specific window, and those windows were tight as balls, so this was a big change. If an attack connected or you were in recovery, you got a more expensive version of Roman Cancel with red and purple RC. But the one we want to talk about right now is YRC. YRC is a defining feature of Xrd, having it basically shape the entire metagame around it. Having it slow down time slightly and cost only 25 meter is an extremely versatile tool that you can use in a bunch of different situations. But the main thing I learned to do with it, apart from Gunflame YRC, is to use it to cover my mistakes. Baiken goes to parry my move. No, she doesn't. Gonna miss that attack. No, I ain't. DP whiff. okay, you can't use it for that one. YRC is able to make it so that the mistakes that you made don't really matter that much, and the meter is gained so quickly in this game that you might as well go for it. Now, in Strive, your Roman cancels are much more expensive, with every version costing half a bar to use. However, if you have the meter, using it to cover up your mistakes is still a good idea. Strive Roman cancel system is able to give you different properties depending on the Roman cancel used, thanks to the slowdown effect, meaning that you can get new pressure and mix-up options depending on the Roman cancel you use. It's also a good way to not get yourself killed. Leo or bike and about to parry that super? Nope. About to get anti-ed? Nah. Whiff DP? Once again, you can't use it for that. A lot of things in fighting games can be seen as resources, and the way that you spend them is an integral part on if you win or lose. With a situation where using Roman cancel would save you from getting hit, you have to evaluate if losing your tension bar in the situation is more or less valuable than your HP that you're going to lose after they hit you. Now, your HP bar is obviously much more important than your meter, but with characters like Gold, Lewis, and Port, you have a much higher HP pool, and you can take more hits than your average character. So you may actually want to save the meter and make that mistake in some circumstances, so you can have access to reversals and offensive Roman cancels in order to have harder offense when it's your turn again. Or take a character like Giovanna, who gets a substantial buff when she's at 50% tension. If you were to cancel the mistake, your effective HP total goes down, and you lose the chip damage on your normals. Now, I'm sure this isn't exclusive to Strive, and xard probably has characters who definitely want to keep their meter instead of using YRC, but before I played xard, that perspective wasn't really apparent for me because it would happen less in a match, so it was harder for me to catch on to. When I was learning xard, I was playing with a group of my friends who were interested in the series. Between us all, we all had some experience with both Strive and Plus R, but none of us really sunk our teeth into xard before. A couple of us had played xard offline with each other in the University Games Society and stuff, but that ended up with us just pretending that we were punk and spamming DPs and flash kicks at each other. Safe to say we were all practically clueless when it came to playing the game for real, so we were starting on relatively even ground. Because of this, learning the game was a pretty smooth experience. Instead of having someone who had a whole bag of tricks and gimmicks they've been labbing for the past 1,000 years, everyone who played had like 3 mix-ups, basic pressure sequences, and a handful of knowledge checks. Because of this, no one really ever stayed on top of the group for too long, and the best player rotated out pretty quickly. It also meant that when someone had obviously been figured out, they needed to go back to the lab and figure out how to add another layer to their bullshit, or figure out how to actually play fighting game fundamentals. Please guess what the Raven player in our group did with these opportunities. But it was really interesting learning with a group who were all around your skill level. Normally I say when you play fighting games, you want someone who is around your skill level so you can learn off of each other. However, there's a chance that that one person will surpass you, or you end up surpassing them, leaving you kind of fucked. This also happens if they just end up quitting the game. Plus, if you get too tilted or annoyed at their playstyle and need to change your pace, tough shit, you gotta deal with a million mix and you're gonna like it. But with a group, these problems basically fade away. Someone getting better than you? Don't worry, there's several other people at your skill level you can play against to help you catch up. The Dizzy player annoying you with full screen zoning and obnoxious Oki? Don't worry, we got several other characters that do the same things, but in different ways. You're able to rotate between the different people you're playing against, and it allows you to be able to not only catch your breath, but even take things easier if it looks like someone else is surpassing you. It also leads to more hype rivalries and matches, especially if you're all fighting over one cabinet. My favorite experience in any fighting game is having multiple people in a lobby and you're only allowed to use one cabinet to play against each other. It means we're all watching the same match that happens and causes natural storylines to develop as people try to defend themselves and their pride from being hit off. It's obviously not the most effective way to play, but sometimes you don't want efficiency. You want to dominate a lobby, or you want to take down the dude who's popping off. The only thing that would make this better in the long run would be an even larger group filled with people of different skill levels. But thankfully I already have that in Strive, so I don't need to search that bit out. Every modern fighting game has some form of ranked matchmaking. In Street Fighter V and Tekken 7, this is a simple ladder system in which you play to earn points that increases your specific visible rank, which then affects which players you're able to bump into in the queue. Guilty Gear Strive has the tower, in which you're put on a floor and allowed to fight players on that floor and above, but can't venture down to the lower floors. The goal is to get as high as you can, eventually breaking into the celestial floor, where you can fight the best of the best in the game whenever they're in the floor. xard had a similar system to Tekken and Street Fighter, where you start started at the bottom ranks and slowly made your way up as you defeated enemies in order to achieve a high rank. There's just one problem though. The rank queue in xard is, pretty fucking dead. Because of this, the only indicator of skill is the colored box next to your avatar's name while in a lobby. This is actually a common thing in older Arxis games, and they were in games as recent as Dragon Ball FighterZ. Why did they scrap it though? Well, it's not very good. Ranks in most games are generally pretty region-specific because of the terrible netcode in these older games. But these colored squares could straight up be group-specific if all you did was play against your friends. Eventually, after a certain amount of time, they mean literally nothing. Someone could be pink square, but does that mean that they got good because they went into a bunch of different open lobbies? Or do they just have friends that were able to get yellow and orange squares, and because of that, they could play up to pink? Think this is a stupid question and squares mean something? Well, I'm sorry to say that they don't, because there was a time where I played Dragon Ball FighterZ and I was pink square. I was never good at that game. I was barely mid and I managed to get the top square rank, so there's obviously something wrong with this system. So because of the deserted rank system and the unreliable squares, I basically had no idea what I was in for when I fought against any opponent. Your rank meant jack shit. The only way that I could tell if you were good without prior research is by how you played. And this led to an interesting development where I could never be too cocky when going into any match, but I was never really massively nervous like when fighting someone who's a higher rank than I am. The lack of ways to show off how good you are at the game meant that I had to treat the first match against every new opponent similarly and assume that they were going to play well until they proved me otherwise. Well, actually, it was more like I'd assume that they'd play dumb and fall for my basic bullshit until they proved that that wouldn't work, and then I had to rely on fundamentals, but it led to a more interesting experience that engaged me every time I fought a new opponent. Strive, similarly, doesn't have a traditional ranking system, but there are ways to figure out how good a player is, such as the floor that they're on, if they have an aura or not, and of course, Rating Update, the site which tracks your theoretical MMR. However, if you decide to ignore these things and force yourself to play in the tower like you would in an xard lobby, by assuming that every player is good and changing that assumption based on how they play, you'll find yourself learning more and playing better than if you underestimate or overestimate your opponents or yourself from the get-go. It's also just a better experience. Not having anything to worry about while playing and just having the consequences of your match be that you won or that you lost is a nice change of pace when comparing it to a number that defines how good you are, constantly changing, or that was the match that decided if you got to the next floor and you failed, or having to queue again because you didn't get your daily aura grind wins. Sure, stakes are fun, but constant stakes get tiring and stressful. If you really want to learn a fighting game, you need to disconnect yourself from all of that and just learn to enjoy the process of playing the game, and xard has the ability to do that. Now, these last two things are things that I could have learned from basically any game and not xard, but the rollback beta was the perfect storm of situations where most of my friends were trying the game, the netcode was godlike, and didn't cause any inconveniences, and I could learn alongside them all without having to play catch-up or tutoring them. It was a great experience, but I still prefer playing Strive. xard I found is a game that is fun with friends. Strive feels like a game that's fun with anyone. The bullshit in Strive is way tamer than the bullshit in xard, and while I'm sure that I could get on top of the game given time, that's not a resource I have a lot of, so I'll stick to the one that I'm more comfortable with. And if you disagree and prefer xard, then great, good for you. Hopefully Arxis won't be taking too long to add that rollback to the game permanently, so keep your eyes peeled for that. Maybe one day I'll go back to xard and actually stick with it, but for now, I'm more than comfortable taking these lessons and getting better at the one that I fell in love with from the start. Now, Arxis, this character that you're adding to Strive better be Jam Slayer or Johnny, because if it's not, I'm going to go crazy. Very special thanks to 64 MHz, Brudakai, Daniel Wiedericht, Lady Dantalon, Maki Yamazaki, Melodically Me, Monact, Proxy, Smeech, Super, Straw Fox, and Tom Tanks for being Tier 2 patrons. Learn how you can join this list in the link in the description.